Well, hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk about some of our work that sits not only in computer science, but increasingly at an overlap with behavioral science, which I think is really exciting. And for a long time, people have asked, why in engineering? Why do we focus on talking about emotion? Why do we focus on talking about behavior? And as it turns out, the reason is becoming more obvious to everyone. I think when you really think about the major societal problems that exist in our world today, you're thinking about problems that are cross-disciplinary. When problems are cross-disciplinary, that means that both sides of the research problem get to come together and say, what can I bring to the table? What can you bring to the table? And by talking together, what new research can we come up with? What new findings can we have? What new insights can we gather? And we're seeing this not only in computer science by itself, but really through interactions with other fields. Looking at kids with autism, for example. So one finding that's come out that's really interesting recently is that some of the parameters that people use when they're analyzing the behavior of these kids aren't the parameters that people thought they were using. And it was by looking at speech patterns that they really began to realize some new types of cues that would differentiate kids at risk for autism versus kids who are typically developing. We're seeing the same thing in depression. For a long time, people have characterized depressed speech as monotonic. To a lot of people, that meant the pitch or the fundamental frequency of your voice was relatively constant. As it turns out, when you looked at it from an engineering perspective, this wasn't as true. And what new findings in the field are showing is there are actually other ways of characterizing really what that type of consistency or monotonicity means. We're seeing the same things in marital therapy, trying to predict outcomes that are predictive of sort of good or bad outcomes. General interaction dynamics, really trying to characterize the types of behaviors that lead to better or worse outcomes. And finally, psychiatric disorders, trying to figure out what types of cues really allow you to have effective monitoring over time. And to sort of echo a slide that Amy had early on, I'd like to talk about why this is really interesting from an engineering perspective, but also generally from a collaborative perspective. So as a computer scientist, one of the things that I require are labels. I strongly require that my data are labeled. This is how I find associations between short-time measurements in my data and long-term outcome. As it turns out, the idea of labels is not necessarily general across all research areas. So for example, we work closely with folks at the Depression Center, really trying to understand how we can track mood for people with bipolar disorder. Several months on, through continued conversation about how we were actually going to label our data, it became clear that that's not how people in that type of science really think about working with data. So really, again, having this cross-disciplinary conversation about what it means to really think about how you characterize individuals ends up being critical. Now, once you have this information about how you're going to assign people to categories or to relatively rank individuals, you still need to think about how to measure behavior. Now, in engineering, what we like to say is, well, here are the things that I need, so here are the things you will record. Now, as it turns out, when you're talking about natural interactions, that type of a mission statement, let's say, or requirements document is not very useful. If you're asking for information that you would never have in a real use case, then that's not information you can use to sense your population. And so really having a sense for how you're going to measure your data and what that means is critical. Once you have that, you still need to figure out how to extract short-time measurements, and even more critically, how you're going to associate huge pieces of data with very small labels. So for example, I might have a clinical interaction that goes on for 4 hours. Somewhere within that interaction, someone decided that the individual was depressed. Where did that happen, and how, by mining the data, can I learn that more accurately? I need to have a way to quantify that information so that when my system processes it, it can still continue to work with it. So I need good ways of representing the data in a way that's computationally sound. And finally, the environment. It changes behavior, but it also changes the signal itself. Let's say I'm thinking about working with acoustics. Well, in this room, for example, there's quite a lot of reverberation. Outside, there's quite a lot of noise due to traffic, especially in larger cities, maybe not as much here. If I'm thinking about collecting data in a restaurant, for example, there's a lot of babbling in the background. It's called babble noise in my field, talking in the background. And so really thinking about how the environment shapes both the signal and also the behavior of the individuals that you're measuring is completely critical. And so, rather than seeing this as something that means you should never, ever, ever go into this field, you see it as a chance for opportunities to adapt, to create, and to invent new strategies. And so my work, then the work of my group, is focused in two broad areas. The first one is in modeling emotion, both the expressions of behavior and how to understand the perception of individuals. We also work in assistive technology, thinking about how we can use speech to create societally useful tools. So for example, we look at providing feedback for individuals with aphasia, individuals with language loss, and also mood state tracking for individuals with bipolar disorder, and we're just starting projects looking at how you can assess risk for individuals who are at risk for suicide. The first part of my talk will talk about expression modeling, the second part, aphasia, assuming we have time, and of course, throughout actually. If you have questions, please do feel free. It's always nice to have interaction. So why is speech an interesting field? Why is this something that's worth pursuing? But as it turns out, it's actually a very hard problem to do this with speech. And the reason why is that speech isn't one thing. It's not a signal that conveys only mood, or only emotion, or only the lexical content of what you're saying, or only the environment. No, it encodes all of this information, and it encodes it over different timescales. So one of the reasons why it's so interesting to work on this signal is you get to explore not only effective machine learning techniques to be able to pull out the information that you care about, not only effective signal processing to do the same, but really you're looking for approaches that allow you to control for variability that occurs over both short time and long time. And specifically when we're talking about speech, we can think about the varied timescales that exist. So over the shortest timescales, you're thinking about speech content. What I'm saying, it results in a very, very highly variant signal. Over longer term, you're thinking about the expressions that I'm saying. Slightly longer term, you're thinking about emotion. Longer term still, you're thinking about moods. Then you're thinking about emotional disorders that might persist. And finally, personality traits. So trying to figure out how to tease apart all of these sources of information from a highly time variant signal ends up being very, very challenging and interesting. And so if we think about what we have some kind of waveform that comes in, which we call speech. One generally calls speech. We window the data over these very, very short time frames, and we extract information that include things like pitch, energy, and various spectral properties, the frequency properties of the voice, things like speaking rate. And this gives us sets of features that we extract in time. What we can then do is think about gathering this information to process something at a higher level. So for example, we might grab a set of speech, maybe on the order of about a quarter of a second, and extract statistics of it. We can do this later as well. Then what we can do is try to estimate the emotion content, for example, if we're talking about emotion, that exists in these. And the reason why this is interesting is that then you can start to characterize speech, not in terms of the lexical variation, which of course is very interesting, but in terms of some kind of higher level property, one such high level property being emotion. We might be interested in a given sentence, so this is just sort of an illustration of one. We might be interested in how four things are happening. How anger is expressed over time, how happiness is expressed over time, how neutrality is expressed over time, and how sadness is expressed over time. And the reason why this is interesting is that usually when we think, as engineers for a second, when we think about characterizing behavior, we assume it's uniformly expressed. As it turns out, emotion isn't. Emotion is dynamic. It changes through time, and those changes through time are fascinating. And so what we wanted to try to do, what we are trying to do, is figure out how we can use the dynamic properties that exist through changes in anger, changes in sadness, changes in neutrality, to try to figure out how we can characterize dynamics. And what we're trying to do is come up with new ways of finding and interpreting meaningful short-time dynamics in emotional speech. Maybe what we have is decreasing anger over time, which is generally what we'd hope to have in any kind of mediated or intervention style interaction, not always what you have. You might have increasing happiness followed by decreasing happiness. You could have consistent sadness. But really what we want to do is figure out ways to effectively find these patterns and then interpret them. First, I'll talk about finding. One thing we can do is we can take time series that again express how emotion flows in time, where in this case, we're just looking at arbitrary time series, but we can say that Green, for example, is how neutrality flows in time. The purple would be sadness, red would be anger, and blue would be happiness. And we'd be interested in trying to figure out how we can estimate some kind of underlying emotion content by looking at a multidimensional time series. By using a set of dynamic models and training data that comes from a population we've not seen before, or that we will not see in testing, we can try to estimate how people will generally perceive that utterance. So how do we quantify the emotion characteristics? So generally, any data that we work with are labeled, and they're labeled in one of two ways. One is through discrete emotion labels, where we ask evaluators to tell us if an utterance is angry, happy, sad, neutral. A larger set includes things like disgust, fear, surprise, excitement, and other, generally. So we either go with discrete labels or we characterize things in a dimensional space. So we would look at emotion being characterized as valence, so positive versus negative, and activation, which would be calm versus excited. So depending on the type of the study, and very importantly, depending on the goal of the study, we use usually one of those two ways of characterizing the data.
And so is there any way to think about standardizing across subjects for their...
Yes, so that's a great question. So the question is, can we think about ways of standardizing across subjects? And as it turns out, that's critical, and actually it's part of the reason why people focus on one type of labeling versus another. And it's not even just standardizing across subjects, but it's also standardizing across context. So if you think about discrete labeling, imagine you have the emotion of fear. One data set, I don't know, it's from Survivor or something like that, where someone's getting chased by some poisonous something. And so fear involves, fear of life. The other one is a student data set where the data were recorded right before a major exam. That's fear of failing. They're both fear, but the expressions of fear are incredibly different, especially at a physiological level. And so by just relying on these discrete labels, we can end up in a situation where, although both instances are fear, the underlying signals are incredibly different, which is why people oftentimes, in a more general context, will use valence and activation. So it talks more about observable behavior. And in that case, to directly answer the question you asked, you can normalize. So let's say that an individual has a higher resting activation level compared to somebody else, and you want to look at how those patterns vary in time, you can normalize so they have the same mean and the same standard deviation. Right, so dynamics. So what we can find here is that dynamics can tell us a lot about what's going on in an utterance. However, the challenge here is that what we're generally looking at when we think about this type of characterization are dynamics that occur over an entire utterance, over an entire piece of data. But as it turns out, that might be misleading. So imagine, for instance, a 30-second clip where an individual is mostly speaking in a neutral tone of voice, erupts in anger, manages to control him or herself, goes back to speaking in a neutral tone of voice. The majority of that utterance is going to be neutral. The patterns are very representative of neutrality. Any observer would say, there seems to be anger going on here. And so what we also are really interested in doing is trying to think about how we can take long-term dynamical trends and find short-term patterns that might be more representative of how people will actually interpret information. So we're looking for what we call salient local patterns, which will enable us to somehow characterize the data and interpret how people will perceive a longer stream of information. And what we can find is that if we're trying to, if you look at the x-axis, it's we say window length, but it's just talking about how long an utterance or a piece of data actually is. And the y-axis, of course, is accuracy. What we can find in general is that the more information that you have, the more accurately you can model emotional information, which makes sense. We know that people need context to be able to interpret behavior. But what we also find is that we can pretty accurately characterize emotion using three different things. One, short time pieces of information. So just at time X, what is the probability that somebody is angry? Or we can look for short time patterns. Let's say from time X to Y, what is the pattern that's underlying this? And what other patterns is this pattern similar to, and how can we use that to estimate our final emotion state? Or we can look for longer-term dynamical trends, all of which are allowing us to interpret emotion. And the reason why this is exciting, is particularly the reason why it's exciting to look for these salient local patterns, is that we can then try to think about at the beginning, I motivated this issue that you have long-term clinical interactions, short-time labels. By using these types of patterns, we argue that we can begin to interpret longer-term information that might be associated with some kind of behavioral marker. So again, take the example of bipolar disorder. This is a disorder that's characterized by mood swings between mania or high levels of energy and depressed or lower levels of energy. Fundamentally, it's also an emotion dysregulation disorder. And so our argument is that by using these types of short-term processing, we're going to be able to begin to understand how we can accumulate large amounts of data that are expressive of an individual's underlying state and really be able to understand what the underlying symptomatology actually is, which is work that's very much ongoing at the moment, so I can't comment on results yet. However, one of the things that we do find is that both short and long-term patterns contribute to our ability to understand emotion, and dynamics play a key role. And we're trying to figure out how we can use this to understand additional types of conditions, bipolar disorder, suicidality, and depression. I'm going to skip additional projects for a second, and I realized we were sort of a bit behind on schedule, so it would be beneficial if I don't take my full time. Fantastic. Okay, so in light of that, I want to briefly talk about our other project, specifically for individuals with aphasia. So aphasia is a language disorder that usually results from some sort of an injury. It could be stroke, traumatic brain injury. It also can result from aging. So for example, dementia can result in primary progressive aphasia. It affects about 2 million people and about 180,000 acquired every year. Now, aphasia is interesting in that I didn't know anything about it until I met with folks from the University of Michigan Aphasia Program, which is an intensive inpatient treatment program on campus. And they said to us, we really need some way of helping our participants to practice their speech outside a clinical environment. What I said back to them is, well, we're not really an app development group, but if you let us collect the speech, we'd be really interested in thinking about how we can collaboratively evolve some sort of a data collection mechanism. And so the reason why I bring this up is that when you're thinking about applications of data science, it's not only what can I immediately get out of a collaboration with a group that's not my own. It's also how can we collaboratively work together to sort of progress both sides. So in this case, what we ended up doing was creating an app that was usable. We have a picture that's displayed to a user. We have 3 slider wheels that allow individuals to form a sentence, subject, verb, and object. The reason this is great for us is at the end we know that what they're trying to say is the sentence that the tablet would have told them was correct. And so we have a target for our speech modeling. What's great from their perspective is that they have practice forming sentences that are representative of images. And one of the things that we've done is to look at how we can develop a system that's composed of, so in this case I was going to talk about transcript, but I'm going to skip that, but that's composed of a data set that we collected of speech from individuals with aphasia, speech of individuals who are healthy, and we looked at how we can advance not only the ability to predict how people will perceive these types of speech patterns, but also speech recognition itself, which is not normally applied to data that are disordered. It works very poorly usually out of the box. And one of the things that we found is that by working with our collaborators, not only to collect the data, but also to really understand the types of features that are meaningful and to understand the types of language patterns and language mistakes that are meaningful, we could get word error rates on the order of about 30% for these data, which I realize sounds high, but is approaching usability. And when we start thinking about sort of this idea of aging in place or allowing individuals to stay in their home as long as possible, a lot of times we're talking about smartphones. Smart homes, and possibly also smartphones. Yeah, it all is, yes. And so one of the reasons why this is important is that if you can have lower word error rate, lower error for speech recognition, all of a sudden you have technologies that were previously unavailable when you have word error rate on the order of 80%, for example, that might now be able to be applied to these domains. So, in honor of time and sticking on the schedule, at least that we received this morning, I'm going to wrap up so that we can have time for our panel discussion. But I will say, if you're interested in our work with bipolar disorder, there's a MINUS seminar last week, so check that out. And generally, as I said at the beginning, we focus on both emotion and assistive technology, and I'd be happy to take any questions, most likely during the panel itself. So thanks for your attention, and thanks for coming.
Math team going to some competition. I often look around the room at my conferences and say, wow, I am the oldest woman in this room. I'm looking around today, I'm not the oldest, not the most senior